in Europe and the rest of the world, but then also explain some of the causes as well. The first part that I want to talk about is how World War I impacts the Depression. There are probably two topics that are results or part of the aftermath of World War I that causes or is part of the long-term set of causes for the Great Depression. The first one has to do with the American farm sector. World War I increases demand for U.S. crops. U.S. farmers see the need for food to be delivered to Europe, not only to feed U.S. soldiers when the U.S. joins the war, but also to feed Europeans who are not able to feed themselves because so much of the fighting is going on in Europe in a place where farmland is being taken over by troops. So farmers take out huge loans to pay for new technology to produce more food to send to Europe. And this makes sense from an economic perspective. The problem is, at the end of the war, there's no more demand for crops going to Europe, which means the farmers lose money because prices drop drastically at the end of the war. And we're left with a set of farmers that are in debt to banks, but they can't make enough money on their crops in order to be able to pay back the debts that they owe. This has a couple effects. One of them is the farmers end up over farming, which is one of the reasons why the Dust Bowl of the 1930s happens. And then the other thing that happens is banks aren't getting paid back their money because farmers aren't paying them back, which leads banks to look for other investments like the stock market. The second thing going on has to do with war debt, and that first, this is partially Germany, partially Britain and France. Germany, after World War I, as you know from your reading about the Treaty of Versailles, that part of the Paris Peace Conference, Germany's forced to pay reparations. Germany has no money at the end of the war. They cannot pay this money back, so they print money. This causes massive hyperinflation and crushes the German economy during the early 1920s. They do slowly recover, but they're unwilling, the government, the Weimar Republic, which is the government that's created at the end, it's a democratic republic created at the end of World War I, is unwilling to spend money in the early 30s to recover from the depression that happens 1929, 1930, and this is one of the reasons why Hitler is able to take power by 1933. At the same time, Britain and France owe the U.S. money from World War I. They borrowed money to pay for the war effort, to be able to pay for the industrialization and the supplies that are needed for the war. This ultimately creates a reliance on U.S. currency and reliance on U.S. gold. It actually increases gold flows into the United States to pay for all the supplies, which means that the economies of Britain, France, and the U.S. are ultimately pretty well connected by 1929. So when the U.S. economy crashes and the stock market collapses in 1929, there's going to be a spillover effect to Britain and France. I created a short video when I was student teaching about 10 years ago to explain this part, and I swear to God I made this far before the Crash Course World History people ever made theirs. In any event, you have the U.S. and Europe. So the U.S. lends about $11 billion to the Allies during World War I. Looks cool. The problem is that Britain and France are having trouble paying back that money. But the U.S. requires those payments, and so they come up with a plan in the middle of the 1920s. And the plan is this. The U.S. will loan money to Britain and France so they can stimulate their economy to be able to produce more revenue to pay back the initial loans that they owe America. Is this going to work? No. The problem is that France and England aren't able to rebuild their economies enough. They slip deeper into debt, which makes it harder to pay back their loans. At the same time, there's another thing going on in the U.S. that's going to make this problem worse. Congress is in very much a buy America mood. This is actually a time of relative economic growth for America, and the Congress wants people to buy American goods. This promotes American business. So they make it harder to sell European or have Europeans sell goods in America. They use what are called tariffs or taxes on imported goods to be able to prevent European goods from coming into America. Tariffs are not actually barbed wire. That's the best representative I could come up for tariffs. which means that Europe can't sell its goods in America. This is good for the Buy America campaign, but the problem is this. This makes it harder for Europe to pay back the loans, which means that they don't have enough money to buy American goods, and it has the effect of undercutting the American economy inadvertently. All those trends are going on as a result of World War I. Ultimately, there's a fairly coherent argument that World War I and the aftermath of World War I is part of the reason why the economic collapse of the 1930s happens. And there's an argument that the economic collapse of the 1930s helps contribute to World War II. So ultimately, there's a connection between these three events. And I want to talk about the American situation with stock market and bank collapse in order to explain how the Depression 1929 spills over to the rest of the world. The first part is a little bit of background, and we need to talk about what a stock is and how a stock price is determined. Stock is a portion of a company. Companies, ultimately publicly traded companies, are divided up into pieces, and if you want to own a piece of that company, you buy stock in that company. The price of a stock is determined entirely by supply and demand. If someone else wants to buy stock from you, you negotiate a price, and basically that first stock sale sets a price for the stock. If lots of people want the stock, you can charge more money for it because it's in demand. If no one wants the stock, then the price would tend to go down because you can't sell it for anything because no one wants it. So what was going on during the 1920s is people started speculating in the stock market. And by speculating, I meant they borrowed money in order to buy stocks. So this graphic on the left helps explain this. Let's say you had $100. You would borrow $900 from a stockbroker, from a bank, and you would therefore have $1,000 to invest in the stock market. You'd wait about 6 months and be able to sell that stock for about $1,500 because the stock market, the value of the stock market, kept going up over the 1920s, which means you can pay the broker back their $900. You pay $100 in interest to the broker for the ability to borrow this loan, but you make $500, and then you could take that $500, borrow more money, and reinvest if you wanted to. The problem is, after 1929, when the stock market starts to collapse, people who had borrowed money can't sell their stock for the amount that they had borrowed, which means they go into debt and they're unable to pay the stockbroker back. And this is ultimately what happens in 1929. So in the fall of October 1929, this, by the way, is something that you need to understand, but I don't think you need to take notes on because there's not going to be a question about the specifics of the 1929 stock market crash on any test. That said, on October 24th, there's a day called Black Thursday where investors had started to worry that the prices of the stocks had gone up very high and really weren't representative of how successful the companies were. And so the idea was you should sell the stock at the highest price you're ever going to get for it. So people start to sell stock. The problem is that increases the supply of the stock, which means that the price of the stock goes down. And there's a bunch of people selling stock because they see the price going down and they want to sell their stock before they lose too much money. The next day, investors try to pump the market back up. They try to actually buy up everyone's stock. A relatively small group of investors says, we'll buy every stock that everyone wants to sell. And that way you can create demand for stock and stop the market from selling off. And that works for a day, but ultimately over the weekend, everyone freaks out and there's 2 days of a sell-off in which about $20 billion of money is lost. This is not actual money lost, but it's if the value of your stock you think is at $100 and that stock goes down to $50, then you've quote-unquote lost $50. You never had it in your pocket, but you could have sold the stock for $100. Now you can only sell it for $50. And so you have about $20 billion in money lost. To put that in comparison, the money lost in the first month of the stock market collapse in October 1929 is equal to the entirety of the money that the U.S. spends in World War I. Bank collapse is the other part of this that's related. The stock market panic causes a run on personal bank withdrawals, which means people go to the bank, they ask for their money back. The problem is that banks have invested individuals' money in the stock market, which means they don't have enough money to repay their customers. In 1929, if a bank doesn't have enough money to repay its customers, it closes, and people just lose their money. There's no insurance, there's no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That was created during the New Deal to help fix this problem. So in 1929, about 600 banks closed, which is really not that many because there were about 25,000 banks in America at this time. Every neighborhood had their own bank. It wasn't like you had a huge bank like Chase or Bank of America that had multiple branches. Those were all individual banks. So you have a few banks closing in 1929, but by 1933, you have about 40% of all the banks in America that are literally just closed, and there's no money left in those banks for anyone, which means 40% of the American population loses their life savings and has no money. Coupled with unemployment that is increasing, unemployment gets to about 25% by 1933, and that's ultimately the worst part of the Depression. There are two different responses that I want to talk about, one with similarities around the world and one with a set of differences. You read a little bit about this at the very end of the section. I want to explain it in a little more detail. The main similarity between the responses around the world is military spending as the solution to the Depression. The New Deal that you read about, a program that Franklin Roosevelt created in the 1930s to respond to the Depression, does not actually solve the Depression. The U.S. economy in 1938 and 39 is relatively similar to where it was in 32 and 33. The thing that helps the American economy grow out of the Depression is a massive increase in military spending as the U.S. starts to gear up to fight in World War II. So this increases jobs, and with those jobs increases consumer spending. This is also the solution in Japan, also the solution in Germany. So the connection between the Great Depression and World War II is in part that military spending is the solution to the depressions. The main difference is that forms of government either change or don't change depending on where you're at. You have Britain, France, and the US, which all pursue what the book calls democratic socialism, which is basically a way of saying the government spends more money to promote economic growth, but there's not a fundamental change in government. The Constitution of the United States doesn't change during the 1930s, nor do the constitutions of Britain or France really in substantial ways. The difference is that in Italy, Japan, and Germany, the Depression creates support for an entirely new form of government. And you'll read about these for Thursday, but ultimately those three countries have a change in government that allows them to form the Axis powers and ultimately fight World War II against Britain, France, and the United States. So the Depression has the effect of increasing discontent in Italy, Japan, and Germany. That discontent helps support authoritarian governments, which then leads to World War II. Have a good day. See you guys tomorrow.